And my final question, what are the barriers to developing a primary prevention approach for Battersea's health and well-being?
Yeah, there are a lot of barriers. So in today's event, I led a round table discussing this very question. What are the barriers to, really embedding a preventative health approach on a wider scale? And really there's this question around co-design and co-production, and how do we enable that? How do we ensure that? I think there's a real responsibility for those decision makers and funders to embed community voice and really devolve power to those community leaders who are at the front lines of change. Communities know best what they need and what they're doing, and we need to empower them. We need to not consider them an afterthought, but in the very early stages of funding, really embed their voice and support their voice in steering the overall direction of good outcomes. So co-designing a really shared model of partnership working led by the community.
I think many organisations end up having to be in survival mode and putting out fires because they just do not have the space to do what they set out to do, because it's so stressful, like having to get the money and having the resources. And so it really makes a difference, I think, when people do come together. And to be honest, those application forms for fundings are a nightmare. They're so bureaucratic and long, and it kind of can be a real drain when you don't have the capacity to have a fundraiser to deal with all of that bureaucracy. So do away with bureaucracy.
Again, it really goes back to how you can have great collaboration with the Alliance and the voluntary sector, and ones with council, and also with the South West London Integrated Care Board. Those are the key things that need to happen. Set those foundations, have the partnerships in place, and ultimately where the voluntary sector can also play its role in delivering some of those initiatives.
Primary barriers for developing a co-production approach are really that lack of consultation with communities is the main one. You need to make sure that you include communities in that process from the very beginning to make sure you identify the barriers and the challenge that they might have in accessing services or any of the projects that you co-design.
Well, I think the barriers often are man-made, aren't they? We often, it's because we are in our sovereign organisations, we're focused on what we think is important, and we need to buy into that the collective power of us working together, but also the collective problem that we're trying to achieve a result in. So I think really it is about us coming together more and making sure that we understand each other's opportunities, but also some of our challenges as well. We know that at the moment we within society we don't have lots of funding going into public services, so we really need to think about innovative approaches with the community sector to then making services different for people.
I think that the main barriers that we face at the moment is organisations letting their guard down a little bit and to be open to have conversations. I think sometimes you need to look outside, and we can all get bogged down occasionally by worrying about what we're doing in our own organisations without thinking about how that impacts on the greater area. So I think for Keys House and for the members of Youth Battersea, what we've done is really think of the young people as the catalyst and how we can make their experience better rather than just looking at what our individual organisations can do. And I think that really needs to happen. And it is a bit of a change of mindset, and to really embrace the working together and working collaboratively is a real benefit, not just to the people we're working with, but to the organisations and to Battersea as a whole. Thank you.
Well, I suppose, like most things, ultimately resources are an issue. But even with limited resources, obviously public sector funds, local authority funds are limited. But it's a question of actually targeting where you can actually have the biggest bang for your money spent. And that is really what we're about. So in most things we do, including work with the voluntary and community sector, we undertook a needs assessment, identifying the high priorities, identifying the things that the community actually needs, and actually putting them into practice and working with them to achieve our joint goals.
I think the biggest barrier is time. So the key focus should be communication, and as I said in my previous response, improving communication, understanding of each other's responsibilities. But the key barrier is time. Everybody is so busy, there's not enough hours in the day, so it's about how we create that time for people to talk and communicate, and then recognise opportunities to work together better.
What are the barriers of preventing... well, I suppose you've got to have people's goodwill to start with. You've got to understand the strength of a partnership. I suppose funding is critical. Pointing out or letting people understand that the social investment of people working in their enterprises as actually saving money, saving costs, and building and strengthening the community. So the barriers themselves are, I suppose, I suppose it's money again, but it's really the opportunity of sometimes it's somewhere to meet and talk and discuss and work out, how best to work together. So I think a space, money, and the goodwill is really what's needed.
Thank you.
Okay.
In closing, would you like to give a word of congratulations?
I think the primary barriers will be around funding, as it goes back to most conversations and where that funding comes from. What is the power dynamic within decision making within communities, so that when you do make decisions around funding, around assets or delivery, that the funding is based on what a return is based on what is good for the community, not the fiduciary duty of the funder. I think it's important that we go from a system where fiduciary assets is around care and fiduciary duties are aligned to those. Ultimately, we're trying to change a funding model through a systemic change to how money flows. I think that barrier is always the greatest barrier, but once you actually overcome that barrier and try to have a systemic approach to how decisions are made, the funders will be there. Unfortunately, the funders even don't know how to do this. A lot of funders are trying to invest in communities through community wealth funds, but it still takes a lot of technical skill to be able to do it, and they have to recalibrate their understanding of where the risk sits and also understand what are their fiduciary duties. They can't be aligned to shareholder value, they have to be aligned to values within our communities that we have set. It's a tricky one, but we'll get there.
Before you, in closing, would you like to give a congratulations?
Time and finances. Time for all those involved, particularly those in the statutory organisations. I think there's a lot of willingness. I think we are so pressed for time because, again, we're so target driven and because finances are so poor, but also flexibility. And without time and without financial resources as well, and a commitment from those both in the council and the ICB to enable us to have these times to co-create with the other voluntary organisations, we are really stymied from a statutory organisation point of view. I love hearing what the voluntary organisations have got to say. I think they give us a lot of wealth and richness that we have no idea about. And so the more time we can spend around the table, the better as far as I'm concerned.
So I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, one of the biggest barriers that we have, is actually working with the ICB and the NHS before any kind of plan has been released. Often voluntary sector organisations are the voices of the communities. We've got many organisations that are out there that actually are speaking to a very niche demographic, set of demographics that may not be comfortable going to the NHS or the ICB as a whole, people that may be quite sceptic as well. And it's these voices that need to be elevated, and we need to be able to make sure that they are being heard by the ICB and by the statutory bodies before they actually create certain goals and contracts that they would like to do in certain projects. So I think one of the key things that we need to do is to make sure that voluntary sector organisations are at the forefront and are known in advance and are worked with in advance to understand what the problems are faced by their communities, to understand what outcomes and what other projects can be done by the ICB to help tackle these problems that they're having. Thank you.
I think the main barriers are that each of us are trying to survive, and that can become the be-all and end-all of our aims, and rather than trying to look into a broader impact on the community, which I think is the change that this alliance can bring about.
The barriers are basically funding and the lack of funding that we have. Also, the strict measures when you do get funding, the procedures you go through, the knockbacks that you get, and just not getting the help out there that you need. So I'd like to see more, I would say, easier access to know how to tackle the issue that is going on and help those in the community that need your help gain quicker access to the things they need.
Communication, I think that's the key thing that came out in one of our groups, is breaking down those barriers of communication and making people understand the need to be able to communicate on all different levels, so that those voices that don't often get heard, maybe have the most important thing to be able to say, get listened to.
I think it's the barriers are essentially things like not being accessible in places that the community sees as being safe. Things like if there's a mental health issue, having to go to somewhere like Springfield Hospital, which comes with the whole stigma around it, and not being flexible enough. I think also thresholds are a key issue. I think we need to look at the fact that there are multiple different thresholds for multiple different issues.
So I think this is a tricky one. You know, there's always feedback about information sharing. You know, how do we ensure that people know what support is out there to support them, to reach their potential, to meet their needs? How do we then, as partners that deliver services, work together to ensure that information is out there and support each other to support the people that ultimately we're trying to support? I think that often there sometimes seems to be trickiness in understanding what else is in the system, and so it's about, again, having the right people in the room, listening to each other and ensuring that we can work together to reach our common goals.
Probably money. It's usually a barrier, but there is money around and it needs to be better used. I think probably there might sometimes be a barrier in terms of people's ability to think and take a step back and think strategically, rather than just be caught up in the operations of their own organisations, because obviously charities and voluntary sector are under a lot of pressure, and it's very easy and totally understandable as well, by the way, for people from those organisations and leaders of them to be very wound up in the day-to-day. So that could be a barrier. But I think there's a lot of will in this room, and a lot of hopefully energy, which will really help. I'd just like to finish by saying a big well done to everyone linked with the Battersea Alliance. It's been a really good morning. There's a lot of good conversations in the room and some really impressive presentations as well. It sounds like there's a lot of goodwill to start doing something new and different, but also not forgetting the past, and to build on a lot of the expertise and knowledge and experiences that have also kind of got people to this stage already. And I'm excited, I'm energised, and I'm hoping to play my part going forward. Thank you.
Well, I've actually just had to ask what a primary prevention approach is. So I think that one of the things that is a barrier is shared language and saying things that are not jargonized or only make sense to one type of professional demographic or person or world. So the way that I would maybe define this primary prevention approach is really about how are we accessible as a first port of call to the people that need it the most, and also what does that look like practically if you're looking at trying to sustain interventions and relationships with people. So I think the barriers are long-term funding for sustainability, long-term strategic vision, which really enables people to come around the table and work together and feel purposeful about a shared goal which is defined, which is understood by them, and which they have the resources to deliver. I think that funding and the way that the world of funding works is very limiting, especially for the voluntary sector, but actually for all of us, because if we're working in silos of I've got money, you haven't, could you do this to help me? No, I can't. I don't have that money. I don't have that infrastructure. I don't have that time. Then we're all tripping up along the way towards whatever it is that we're trying to do. I think that there's a lot of miscommunication between the different services and ways that things are working in a more target-driven, agenda-based approach as opposed to from relationship with people, and really looking at what is possible within those smaller communities or groups, what's tangible, what is going to work for them, what is going to make them feel that their needs are most being met in that moment, rather than ticking a box or wanting to create an avenue for research or for another kind of preconceived way of working that already is happening or needs to happen in order to prove whatever it is that you're trying to prove in that moment. So yeah, I think shared spaces where these things can be happening, and again where creativity can facilitate those things so that it's fun and it's entertaining and it doesn't feel like a broken record of the types of questions and needs and issues that we're trying to address, would be a good way to tackle some of those barriers.
I think some of the barriers to moving forward with this is that we probably need to think radically different how we work together. And I think there will be some barriers with organisations or individuals who are used to working in a particular way. So it will be important for us to try and come together and persuade and move across those barriers. I think some of those barriers may well be about capacity, either of individuals or organisations, to be able to contribute towards the work that we need to do. And also, I think some of the barriers may well also be financial. And hopefully what we've talked about today, about pooling funds, bringing money into our community from the outside, hopefully that will help us overcome some of those financial challenges as well.
What are the obstacles? Well, I guess communication is one. I think that seeing that you're part of the solution and not the total solution yourself. I think it's the importance of seeing that others can be part of the solution. It's important working together, and all those different things. Yeah, it's not an equation. And it's not a geometric thing. It is about people.